Hello everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the Circular Revival. Today with us, Paola Conconi. She's economics professor from Oxford University. And so, welcome, Professor. Happy to see you in Circular Revival.
Thank you for having me.
Uh-huh. So, I had some questions related to your personal works and like your field, your major. And so my first question, like, what drew you to international trade and specifically to questions of firm organization and political economy?
Okay, maybe to put some context. So I know you're studying to think about becoming an economist. When I started as a bachelor, so you're not
Uh-huh.
yet a bachelor, but when I started, I actually wanted to do international relations, diplomacy. I didn't want to be an economist. So I did actually political science and international relations before doing economics. And I realized that there were a lot of topics that really were about international economic relations, but they require rigorous economics and statistics and game theory. So the topics I'm interested in are still, if you want, related to what I studied before economics, but now I use economic tools to address questions related to those, political science or international relations questions. So, if you want, if you look at my background, it's not very linear. I didn't go straight into economics. Again, my
Uh-huh.
master's and PhD in economics came after I studied these other more interdisciplinary fields.
Uh-huh.
So, and indeed, within economics, I've been an economist now for many, many years, but I do work on international trade. That's my main field. Political economy and firm organization. These are the three main fields. And a lot of the work I do is at the interplay between them. So, for example, I received a major grant from the ERC that was precisely about the relationship, two-way relationship between trade agreements and supply chains. Supply chains is about how firms organize their production, and in a way, firms can shape trade agreements, and trade agreements and trade policy more generally can shape firm organization. And that research agenda has several projects that was looking at this two-way interaction. And there you have the three fields in that kind of research agenda. The three fields are all part of it, because some projects, like the one you wanted me to also discuss next, are about political economy of trade agreements through firms. So you have really the three themes all united in one project. But in general, yes, I'm still inspired by addressing key novel questions related to international economics, but often looking at the politics, how politics affects economics, and and what are the consequences, also policies for firms. So this is the broad themes of my research. Yeah.
Oh, all right, got it. And my next question, like, when countries start raising tariffs, or pulling back from global supply chains, does that force local companies to innovate more, or does it just slow down their progress?
That's interesting. So I think we don't have definite answers to this very, very broad question. There's definitely, so we know that there's pro-competitive effects of trade liberalization. So if you now raise tariff, this reduces competition, and we know the competition is good for innovation. On the other hand, there are theories and some evidence that sometimes if you protect an industry, this can foster, with under some conditions, innovation, like the infant industry argument. It is tricky. I think for me, open exchanges favor innovation much more than than protection. And innovation relies ideas floating, intermediate goods floating. If you start putting barriers to goods floating, to free movement of goods, in particular intermediate goods that are important for innovation, and free movement of people, like researchers going across countries. I mean, in a world like today, in which a lot of the innovation is in intangibles, I think it's really a bad idea. If the goal is innovation, you don't want to start putting barriers. So I think tariffs are not the instrument you want to foster innovation. They may, under some very precise condition, again, there is a theory on infant industry protection that would suggest that if you have economies of scale, in particular learning by doing, and under some condition you may want to temporarily protect, and that may lead to some innovation, but there are a lot of strings attached. And historically, there are very few examples of successful infant industry protection. So I think usually when trade barriers are introduced, they are not really aimed at fostering innovation, and in any case, they don't usually succeed. But this is a very broad question, and I think there's some, you know, I think most economists would agree with my statement that if you want to foster innovation, you may want to use other policies, not trade protection.
All right, got it. So, and my next question: how can global trade balance the environmental toll of international shipping with the economic benefits of global specialization?
So can you repeat? I didn't quite get. So you're saying
Like,
shipping? I didn't quite get the question. Sorry. Repeat again.
I said, like, how can global trade balance the environmental toll of in international shipping with the economic benefits of global specialization?
Okay.
Like,
Okay.
yeah.
That's another very broad question. So there's a huge literature on trade and environment. In fact, that's strangely, I'm not doing any work on trade and environment these days, but my PhD thesis many years ago was precisely on the interactions between trade and environment. And I think now there is a resurgent literature because, of course, there are different ways in which they interact, and some are maybe positive. If you, through trade, you can have what is called often in jargon technique effects. Countries may actually have incentives to improve and get cleaner, but there are also channels through which trade, by simply fostering production and transportation through shipment or other ways of transportation, can actually have negative environmental consequences. So I think it's hard to balance. I think, governments try to write agreements in which they balance and try to look at the trade-offs and try to regulate. But it's often hard to do it at the multilateral level. So the EU, of course, has CBAM, has initiatives that try to look at how to take into account the environmental consequences in their trade policy and in their environmental, so looking at the interplay. But if you only have even the European Union, which is a subset of countries, do it by themselves without multilateral coordination, obviously the problem is a global one. So I think there's definitely a need to take into account the environmental cost of trade. And I think right now, given that we are lacking international fora to cooperate, we are in a world in which everyone, again, there are protectionist barriers. The World Trade Organization is at a challenging, to say the least, moment. I think it's very hard to, and other organizations, if you look at the World Health Organization or other environmental, funding has been cut, multinational cooperation has been weakened. So I think, this is what you're asking is really important, and these are the questions that your generation and even today we should be addressing. But I think we are in a moment in which the priorities of governments are actually not to, environment has sort of gone more in the background. There's a lot of focus on security. Instead of trade cooperation, there's a lot of protection. And again, until a few years ago, things were different. I think, if you look at up to 2015, it was a much rosier scenario in which there were a lot of, again, fora for discussions, agreements on different, there was a sense in which both on trade, environment, security, there were alliances and agreements that were stable and you could count on. And I think today we are in a very different world in which a lot of the rules that were set up and a lot of the agreements that have been negotiated are sort of, they're not respected. And we do need to have new rules that account for those those costs, those environmental costs. I think at the same time, in terms of the shipping industry, I think they are trying, they're getting cleaner. I know that there is
Uh-huh.
there's some work being done. I can give you some references later about the environmental consequences of shipment in particular. And I think a lot comes from technological change. And I think these shipping companies have got cleaner, and there are policies to incentivize them to use cleaner technology that can help.
Got it. Uh, why do countries that rely heavily on exporting a single good often struggle to, diversify their trade policy?
Another big theme. So here, there's a long history. If you go back into developing countries, often relying on resources, whether it's oil or minerals, and there is indeed literature on the fact that having being rich in these resources can be a curse.
Uh-huh.
In fact, I mean, the problem is it's different problems. Part of it is also a political economy problem in the sense that this richness is often not shared and there's no incentive to invest in other activities. So there's like overinvestment or over reliance on these resources. I think these days a lot of governments are trying to differentiate, diversify. There are actually quite a few countries all over the world, particularly in Africa and Asia, that are trying to use export restrictions and other policies to sort of go up the ladder. So, for example, if you are Indonesia and you're specialized in nickel, or like you've been exporting a lot of these minerals, the idea is like, okay, if I now restrict the exports of these minerals, you will have that production of other stages, maybe processing, manufacturing that uses nickel will expand. And there's some case studies or some mild evidence, and I have a PhD student in Oxford actually working on this, showing that if you try to differentiate by using some industrial policy, including export restriction, there's going to be some incentives to local production in other stages and exports of other stages of production, not just the minerals, but other, say, processing minerals may expand. However, again, when you do so and you try to use these export restriction, it's very limited what you can do. I mean, the more can be done if you have foreign direct investment, like inflow of foreign capital that fosters, again, production in other stages, but without also human capital and without other resources, you cannot just, jump the ladder from, say, minerals to car production or to very sophisticated, complex manufacturing goods, let alone services. I think a lot has to be about also making sure that if you have resources, you need to have other, suppose you have natural resources, you cannot just rely on those. You need to have good education, and you need to have other, capital flowing. You need to create a stable political regulatory environment that makes, that makes not just extraction of those minerals productive, but other activities that may be related. And you cannot expect to jump stages. If there is a ladder to which you go from very upstream activities to more sophisticated downstream activities, this will take time. And again, there's a lot of work showing that even if you use policies to differentiate, it's hard to do so, and you will only do it gradually.
Got it. And my next question is like, why do some countries stay very poor even when they have lots of valuable natural resources?
So, but then we are going back to the similar question of the resource course. And by the way, not all countries are very poor. I mean, I would say some countries are, those that are resource rich, there's variation in whether they're poor or not. Norway is resource rich. So is Saudi Arabia, so is Venezuela, so is like many countries. I think a lot becomes on, a lot depends also on the political and the institutions
Uh-huh.
and how much these resources are shared and invested uh, in the economy. So if you have like a dictatorship and the money is going to the dictator to a small elite and there's no sharing or there's no investing of this resource in education or something that can be good for the broader population, then you'll be stuck with a lot of inequality and not much growth and not much development. But it depends. I think, I don't think you can say in general countries that are resource rich are poor. I think there's often a lot of inequality, but I think there's evidence also of countries that are resource rich and they are, very advanced. So I think it depends a lot on various factors. But it is true that a lot of developing countries, it's surprising because they have resource, and notwithstanding that, you see the GDP per capita, various indicators show them as being lagging behind or being, as you say, poor. So it's not definitely let's say it's not a miracle in any case. Being resource rich, it also depends on how these resources are valued. If you were maybe in the past adding copper is very important. Now if you have rare earth, it's very important because it's needed for semiconductors. So it depends also on technology and how your resources are needed and are, the price for your resources, what you get. But I think independently of that, it depends on how these resources are shared with the broad population and how they are, reinvested.
Yeah. All right. Got it. And what would happen to every? All right. So this is like end of the part one. Like, and I had some questions like about your research paper called globalization for sale. My first question is about like the mystery of silent losers. So the study found that almost 100% of big companies that spend money talking to politicians about trade deals do so to support them. The local companies that will actually hurt from foreign competition stay completely quiet. And my question is like, why don't the local businesses that are going to lose money group together to fight these trade deals? And at what points do you think a failing industry finally decides to stop being quiet and start fighting back?
Okay, so that's definitely much more related to the core of my work. So you're mentioning this paper, Globalization for Sale. So this is indeed a paper in which we start, first of all, just looking at the facts. I will reply to your question in a second, but first of all, we started saying, okay, when we look at a key trade policy, which is trade agreements, if you look at the last decades, there have been hundreds of trade agreements being negotiated. You're from Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan has lots of trade agreements. Europe has negotiated many trade agreements. Many more are being negotiated as we speak. And so this is really a big trend. We went from the early 90s, where there were a handful, to almost 400 now of these free trade agreements. And the question is, what have been the political economy forces that have led to this surge? And so what we looked at in this project is first we looked at the data, and in the US, thanks to what is called the Lobbying Disclosure Act, you can actually look at very detailed information on lobbying by anyone, firms, but also industry association, trade unions, anyone who lobbies, who try to influence policymaking at the federal level, has to report regularly every quarter, every 4 months, how much you spent and lobbying on which issues, and also which institution. Did you lobby Congress? Did you lobby the Department of Congress? Did you lobby? So it's very detailed. In Europe, for example, where there is also a lot of lobbying, this information is much rougher. It's very hard to observe, how much is spent, what exactly. So what we did is to look at lobbying reports and collected all the information on lobbying reports related to trade agreements. And what you can see is really not only how much firms spend and how often they lobby on this issue, but in which direction, meaning in support of these trade agreements or in opposition. So because they're asked when firms are lobbying, or again, anyone who lobbies, you are asked specifically what trade agreement, and you have a lot of information also on the direction of lobbying, in favor of, against. And even when there was no information in a few cases where the reports didn't specify, where you could look at official company statements where you could use the information to code against support or opposition. And what is really puzzling, as you mentioned, is that in the overwhelming majority of cases, we are talking 99% of the cases, well, first of all, even before we get there, firms, individual firms, rather than associations, industry associations, are really the key players. So you see the trade unions spend very little, industry associations spend a bit more, but still very little compared to firms, individual firms who are the big players. And then you look at who are these big players, they're mostly multinational firms. And then you look at what they lobby, what is the direction of their lobbying, and they mostly, again, 99% lobbying in favor of these trade agreements. So that's really puzzling because ex ante, we thought we would find a lot of lobbying by the losers, like small firms or industry association in declining industries. The presumption was, based also on previous work in political economy of trade, that there will be a lot of opposition. But we found the opposite. We found a lot of support by large companies, mostly multinational companies. And so why is it that the losers are silent, as you say? So to me, the explanation we provide is that it's really about the losers not being small. Usually you're a loser. So let me back 1 second. So when you will study economics at university, and if you take a course of international trade, there is now a different view of trade. We used to think that industries trade. So you have an industry, if you're in Uzbekistan, I don't know, what's the industry, the key export industry in Uzbekistan? Tell me what's the key export industry. Tell me something that Uzbekistan exports a lot.
Maybe like cotton,
Cotton.
like
Okay, so
not.
you say there is, but take anything. So the old-fashioned view was that there is an industry, there is an export industry, and there's an import industry, and countries trade at the industry level, and there was no attention to firms and firm heterogeneity. But now for years, since the late 90s, early 2000, we have seen with new data and new models that actually is not that. Even if you look at one specific industry, take textile and apparel, within that industry, in Uzbekistan, in the United States, in any country, there will be small firms, large firms, there will be firms that are very heterogeneous, and only the very large productive ones, say Nike, maybe globally, maybe global firms that export to foreign consumers, firms that import some of their intermediate goods, they use foreign suppliers and have foreign subsidiaries. These are global firms that select into trade. And if you look at small firms, these are firms that cannot afford to be international, because being international, exporting, importing, and foreign subsidiary involves fixed costs. And if you're too small and not productive enough, you're not going to be international. You're going to be a domestic small firm. So if you take this world, and we know we live in this world, then what happens when you look at the politics is the same selection occurs, meaning being politically organized, knowing which institutions in Washington you need to lobby, or in Brussels, or in another place, having a lobbying department, or having a company that you pay to influence policy involves, it's not something that a small firm can do. If you look at the large companies, they all have they hire in-house lawyers, or they have lobbying companies, they pay a lot of money to influence companies. If you're small, again, you cannot afford. So you have this correlation, or that the large companies are the ones that are global and gain from removing trade barriers, because they're exporting, they're importing. So trade agreements benefit them because you can get better access to your foreign consumers and foreign suppliers. But if you're a small company, you're going to be hurt by the trade agreements because you don't benefit from these. You're not serving foreign consumers, you're not using foreign suppliers, and you're going to be competing with the foreign firms that get better access to your market through these trade agreements. At the same time, like you didn't select into trade because they involve fixed cost. If they're fixed cost of being politically organized, you're not going to be able to do it. It's not going to be profitable to you. So what we show is that under what conditions, if lobbying is costly, involves some fixed cost, then it is the losers won't find it profitable in the end to actually be politically organized, because even if they lose, if you want, their stakes are still limited compared to the cost of being politically organized. So you have the large companies are the winners from globalizations and are the ones that can afford being politically organized. Now you ask me something, why don't they get together and
Ah,
lobby
yes.
and that's tricky, because if you think again about, say, the example of the textile industry. In the textile industry, you will have a large company like Nike, and then you'll have small t-shirt producers. You'll have very different. So you cannot say, oh, I'm going to coordinate through an industry association, because in the industry association, you will have large and small firms that have very different interests. So what you should be doing is to say, okay, let's create a coalition of losers that involves small firms in textile, in another industry, across industry, all the losers. But that kind of coordination is even harder than coordination within an industry. So in reality, you don't see it. We looked for, again, coalitions. You don't see losers being organized. And I think the problem is that, again, there is also free riding, and there is like this problem of coordination problems in lobbying, which if you're a large company, you don't face. So what we show in our paper is that if you're a large company, there will be free riding, but you still have incentive to lobby by yourself in favor of your preferred policy. If you're a small company, you would like to coordinate and pay the fixed cost together, but you don't do it. So it's really, when you look at the politics or the political economy on this free trade agreement, and on other topics too, by the way, you do see that it is the large companies that are the ones that are politically active and they have a voice in this lobbying process. Yeah.
Got it. And my next question is about like superstar companies versus small business. So the paper showed that massive financial gains made by giant companies completely dwarf the smaller losses felt by local businesses. What if it was like the opposite? I mean, what if like kind of big companies was kind of losers, and like kind of the winners are kind of small companies.
I mean, so it's depending on the policy. In the case of, again, trade agreements, it's the big companies are definitely the winners. If you take, for example, now trade protection, so the opposite, so instead of liberalizing, you now have tariffs. Clearly, let me give you a concrete example. Of course, since the beginning of the second term of Donald Trump, in January 2026, he started putting more tariffs. In the first term, he was only targeting China. As of the January 2025, he started announcing, actually February to be precise, started announcing tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and then in April of that year, Liberation Day, every country targeted. And this is happening still today. So in the last few days, I don't know whether you saw, more tariffs on Canada. Now, who is actually suffering from these tariffs? Actually, the large companies, mostly the multinational companies. And in fact, they've been trying to lobby against, because if you're a multinational company, say you are GM, producing cars, you have now outsourced, you have your global supply chain, which is actually a regional supply chains in North America. You may make, you know, may have an assembly in Mexico, you may produce the battery in the US, and maybe you have in Canada another part of your production. And you were relying on these free trade regionally and being able to ship parts and components. And now if the administration puts tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and you are a US multinational company like GM or Ford or others, you're going to be suffering a lot from these tariffs. If you're a small producer of, say, on one of these parts and components in the US, you're going to be protected. But if you're a large company, you're going to suffer. So in this case, the losers are the large company. It's sort of the mirror image. But when it comes to the politics, who is lobbying is the large companies. So you often have that these tariffs, they're introduced, but they're often exemptions that large companies get through lobbying. And there's again interesting work not done by myself, but one of my co-authors, Chad Bown, and also Devin Chor, another co-author of mine, looking at lobbying on tariff exemptions. And again, the key players are large companies and not small companies. That is basically you don't have much of a voice if you're a small company, because having a voice requires having a whole machinery. It's about having, let's say it's called, let's say it's paying a fixed cost, but it's really to be politically organized, but really requires hiring people, having capital, knowledge capital, also knowing if you're small, you're not gonna be able to play the game.
Yeah. Yeah, got it. And my next question is about is dealing with stubborn politicians. So the paper discovered that companies actually spend more money on lobbying when they know politicians are leaning toward voting against a trade deal. So how do companies handle risky political bets when politics becomes unpredictable or heavy on trade? How do giant corporations decide if spending millions on lobbying is still worth the risk?
That's a very, very interesting question. There's little work. So in our paper, indeed, we show in the theoretical model that if there was no uncertainty about politicians' stance, there wouldn't be any lobbying, because firms, if you knew for certain what the outcome would be, why would you spend? Suppose you're looking at the ratification of US Korea, you want the agreement to go through. If you're saying, okay, I know for sure that this ratification bill will pass, why would I have to spend any money in favor or against? So you need uncertainty to actually, and that's why we model this as a contest success function. So it's something where the lobbying is done in an uncertain world. And if you didn't have that uncertainty, it wouldn't make sense for you to lobby. And it's interesting because also if you look at the actual data, it often happens that that firms spend indeed millions, if not billions, on policies that in the end don't even go through. Take the Trans-Pacific, the TPP agreement. This was something that, in particular, pharmaceutical companies spent billions to lobby in favor. It took years to negotiate. It was actually signed by President Obama and many other countries in the Pacific. So it would have been, if implemented, it would have been the biggest trade agreement the US had ever negotiated. And then instead of Hillary Clinton being elected, Trump got elected, and on his first day in office, he scrapped. He just said, okay, this agreement, I'm not gonna, he scrapped it, symbolically, and this never reached ratification. So this is agreement, but it's interesting because firms not understanding, so not forecasting these elections, so they lobbied and spent billions lobbying on this agreement, trying to influence the content as well as the ratification. And in the end, this was all done for nothing. But this would have not happened if you didn't have uncertainty. If you were sure, if you lobbied, knowing what happens, or after with a guarantee that the politician, when you lobby them, they carry through, this would not happen. But clearly, there must be some uncertainty. And we know that even today, even more so than in the past, trade policy uncertainty in general has increased dramatically. If you look at any indicator of a policy uncertainty, in trade in particular now, this is skyrocketing. So now, does it mean that lobbying is increasing? I don't know. I think it would be interesting to look at how changes in uncertainty affect lobbying incentives. What I can tell you, I haven't looked at that more as this more general question, but in the context of the lobbying for globalization paper, we show that uncertainty is a key. Without uncertainty, lobbying wouldn't actually arise.
Thank you. And my last question about your research paper is related to the global supply chain shield. So, according to a research paper, companies spend way more money making trade deals if those deals make it cheaper for them to buy parts and raw materials from other countries to make their own products. So, if corporation fails to get a trade deal passed, like meaning those high import taxes do remain, will they just accept the high cost, or will they use their political power to demand the government give them special tax breaks or something like that?
Okay, so I mentioned before the example of GM and other companies lobbying for exemptions. This is happening. So the answer is the latter. So if you are sourcing cheap inputs, parts and components, raw materials from a country with low tariffs, because there is a trade agreement or there is like a low tariffs, MFN tariffs, and now there is an increase in tariffs, you're going to be hurt because the cost of sourcing is going to increase and you're going to try to get an exemption. So this is the systematic work in the past. There's a nice paper on the Review of Economics and Statistics, looking at MFN exemptions, again, looking at firms asking for exemptions from normal tariffs. And there's a lot of work now looking at the special Trump tariffs, at companies asking, can you please exempt me? Exactly what you were saying. At the same time, if firms, and this we know less because this is something more recent, if firms believe that these protectionist policies are there to stay, they may actually, and that asking for exemption may not work, they may reorganize production. So instead of, fragmenting their production across countries, they may reshore some of their production, they may rely on local suppliers, etc. So a lot of these is actually, this is one of the reasons why politicians have been putting tariffs in the US, but in other places, including Europe. There is this now idea that protection can help to reshore activities and to become more self-reliant, because there's this fear that if you source globally, you may be subject to shocks, political shocks, other shocks. And so I think so far, again, the evidence is mixed. There's this work looking at whether firms, there's definitely evidence that firms lobbied for exemptions, but it's also not clear that if you cannot get those, and if you think protection is there to stay, do you now change your organization? And do you go from being very fragmented and rely on suppliers in foreign countries to using domestic supplier for which, you don't have to pay those tariffs? Or do you have, foreign companies investing in say in the US or inside an economy, jumping the tariff? So do this tariff attract, foreign direct investment to avoid those tariffs? Clearly, the incentives are there. The extent to which this has happened, for example, in response to foreign tariffs in the US, is not yet clear. Partly because of the uncertainty, because to reorganize your production, you really want to trust that these things are there to stay, that these policies are certain. You're not going to make big investment in changing your production if you're not sure. So let's see. I think this is an interesting question. Lobbying for exemption is going on. Reorganization of production, I think there's some evidence, but is limited by the uncertainty in trade policy, actually.
Thank you, Professor. Like, those were my all.
Okay. I hope
Those were
this
all questions.
stimulates your interest in economics.
Yeah. Like, more I'm doing, like, like talking about economics, like I'm kind of getting interested in economics because, yeah, like, in the past, like I wasn't that interested, but I'm kind of talking with professors like you and also with my friends who got into some economics, who majored in economics, like kind of they're talking to me. So yeah, and I'm getting more and more like interested in economics. So yeah, thank you. Thank you
No,
for
you're
being.
welcome. You're welcome, and good luck with your application for bachelor.